This is Behind the Headlines, with behind-the-scenes analysis on issues affecting Pennsylvanians, sponsored by the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Now, here's your host.
From Scranton to Pittsburgh, from Erie to Philadelphia, it's Behind the Headlines. And we're here with a new edition. I'm Charlie Greenewald. I'm the Senior Fellow for the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy, and I'm joined by my co-host, Maura Donnelly. Hi, Maura.
Hello, Charlie.
Why, happy holiday season.
Thank you. Same to you.
Goodness, there's so much to celebrate and so much
and be
to
thankful for.
look back at. And one of the things we want to reflect on and continue to study are the midterm elections, which were just held, and the elections here in Pennsylvania. And for that, we have one of the best political analysts in the state of Pennsylvania, Mr. Charlie Gerow, who is the president and CEO of Quantum Communications and is on every Sunday in the CBS affiliate in Harrisburg, Channel 21 on Face the State. Charlie, welcome to our show.
Great to be with you, Charlie and Maura.
Thank you, Charlie.
Well, we're very happy to have you here today. If you were to look, let's start at the national level. What's the biggest surprise at the national level with the midterm elections that we've just held?
The 2014 elections, Charlie, weren't the tsunami that they were in 2010 for Republicans, but it certainly was a tidal wave of great magnitude and significance. You now have the Senate of the United States controlled by Republicans, an even bigger margin in the House, the real opportunity to push back against Barack Obama for these last 2 years. It's incredibly significant. And as you look down below the obvious and begin to see what happened in state legislatures and in governor races all across the country, the Republicans had a very good day as we head into the 2016 cycle.
Well, Pennsylvania was a bit of an anomaly when it comes to the governor's race. Why do you think that was?
It was a disappointment, and it really was an anomaly. You saw Republicans controlling the seats that they held,
Everywhere.
including some difficult ones like Paul LePage in Maine, Scott Walker, Rick Scott in Florida, some tough races that looked like they might be very difficult going in. But you also had pickups in very, very blue states, Massachusetts, Maryland right next door, even Illinois fell into the Republican column, so that now you've only got 15 governors' mansions across the country occupied by Democrats. That does have significance in 2016 because governors control the political apparatus and mechanism and the fundraising mechanisms within their states. So those are the foundational building blocks of a presidential effort.
Now you're reflecting only a part of the state's sentiment when you said that it was disappointing what happened in the Pennsylvania gubernatorial race. That was disappointing for you, but for the supporters of Governor-elect Tom Wolf, they were quite happy about that.
I think it was disappointing for taxpayers, but we'll debate it at another time. But what's interesting about the results in Pennsylvania were that while Tom Wolf, the governor-elect, was successful, Republicans here had historic success. The Senate went back to its 30-20 margin, but that, if you want to go back in history to find when they were at those kinds of numbers, you've got to go a very, very long way. Meanwhile, in the House, the Republicans now enjoy a 35-seat cushion. If you want to go back, you've got to go over half a century to find those kinds of numbers in the House of Representatives. What's very interesting is that the last time you had those kinds of gains and those kinds of numbers in the legislature with a governor's office flipping, it was over 100 years ago. So this really was, in many respects, an anomaly here on the gubernatorial side, and I think it was for reasons totally apart from the agenda of Tom Wolf or the agenda of Tom Corbett. And you saw that in the legislative elections.
Well, while the Democrats were doing a little bit of a happy dance on election night, they have to be a little bit concerned. There certainly wasn't a mandate that came out of what happened in Pennsylvania. And their agenda, I mean, it's not going to be a free ride for them.
It's going to be anything but a free ride. I mean, I don't think there was an agenda, or a mandate rather, for their agenda on election night. And what's very interesting now is, in fairness, I mean, objectively, Tom Wolf talked throughout the course of the campaign about increased spending and increased taxation. And already the leadership of both the House and the Senate have said, good luck. Well, they didn't say it's not going to happen, but they said there's very little appetite. They used very cautious words. Very little appetite for any underlying any tax increases.
Let me cut you off for a second. Did Tom Corbett lose this election, or did Governor-elect Wolf win this election?
Well, sadly, I think you have to conclude that Tom Corbett lost it. And as you know, I was a Corbett supporter. I still have great admiration for the job he did as governor. He did pretty much exactly what he said he was going to do. Unfortunately, the medicine was a little more tasteful in the bottle than it was in the taking.
How'd he lose it?
Well, I think that early on, they weren't, and he had candidly admitted this, as effective as they should have been in pushing back against the message that he had cut education spending. And that lingered. There obviously were some difficulties that arose out of the Penn State situation. Those were bluntly because he was not a terribly political governor. He said he wasn't going to be, and he wasn't. And sometimes folks say, oh, we don't want politicians as governors, but when they get somebody that isn't a politician, maybe we would have preferred to have one that was a little bit more political. And the third thing was he had difficulty getting on track with the legislature, which is an interesting point because he came into office without many positive relationships in the General Assembly. Tom Wolf is in, relatively speaking, the same boat. I mean, he comes in without a lot of historic, long-term, good working relationships in the General Assembly, and I think it's going to be very, very interesting to see how able he is to quickly develop and nurture those kinds of relationships, and I think it will tell us a lot about his 4 years in office.
Well, we've had a pretty significant shift in leadership in the House and the Senate, too, and some are saying it's going a little bit more conservative.
Even if you move past the leadership, which I think the media sometimes focuses on the wrong thing in leadership elections, I try to stay out of them because there's no good to be had for folks in my position getting involved in leadership elections, but they are not only philosophical, they're geographic, and they're stylistic, they're personal in many respects. But it is safe to say that the Republican legislature that's coming in now is two things. One, instead of simply being Republican controlled, it's now Republican dominated. And additionally, it is significantly more conservative than even the legislature that was here just a couple of weeks ago.
What happened to at the national level, though, Charlie? It seems at this point that President Obama doesn't even recognize or acknowledge. He doesn't acknowledge the Republican wave that just occurred.
Midterm elections are retrospective. They're a look back. They're a referendum on what's going on. What's interesting is that presidential elections tend to be prospective. They tend to be visions of what people want for the future of our country. And that's where Republicans are really going to have a challenge over the course of the next year, is in defining what that vision, what that message is for America's future.
Okay, Charlie, we want to thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll come back soon and sort of give us a rundown on what to expect in the new year.
My pleasure to be here. Dr. Greenwald, Mara,
thank you,
always
Charlie.
a pleasure.
Thanks again, Charlie. We will be back with the second segment of Behind the Headline right after this. Stay tuned.
Behind the Headlines is brought to you as a public service by the Hospital and Health System Association of Pennsylvania, helping hospitals provide healing, health, and hope to communities across the state. And by the Pennsylvania Business Council, envisioning a commonwealth in which residents enjoy a very high quality of life in sustainable communities. The council works aggressively to define key long-term policy strategies and solutions to make the commonwealth more competitive, creating and sustaining a better Pennsylvania. Additional underwriting provided by the Worrell Corporation Foundation, based in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, by the Edward H. and Jeannie Arnold Foundation, and by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business. Behind the Headlines is also supported as a public service by Daily Express, transporting construction, farm, and industrial equipment throughout the United States, and by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Visit pahighwayinfo.org.
Hi, welcome back to Behind the Headlines. On this segment of Behind the Headlines, I'm joined by Dr. James Broussard, who's a professor of history at Lebanon Valley College and is the president of Citizens Against Higher Taxes as well. Jim, you have just finished a project you've been working on for several years. You just finished a book on Ronald Reagan, and it's gotten some initially good reviews. And we just wanted to have you on to talk a little bit about your book and about the life of Ronald Reagan. Who's the publisher of this book, and how did you go about deciding to write about President Reagan?
Well, this is a book in a whole series called Historical Americans, put out by Routledge, they publish almost entirely for the academic market. And the reason I got involved is the editor of the series told the publisher, now Broussard will never finish this book, but we should assign it to him out of courtesy. So just to mess with his mind, I decided to actually do it.
And you had a very interesting process by which you finished this book. It reminded me a little bit of David McCullough working in his shed in the backyard up there in New England. How did you go about
Well, I figured you can write anything at 100 words a day, so that's what I did. And, of course, you can't stop at 100. You chug along and, oops, I've gotten 123 or 207 or whatever.
And isn't it true, the book that you the original manuscript that you had was considerably longer than...
Well, I forgot that at the end you have to destroy words, so it really should be 150 a day.
Well, what in terms of Ronald Reagan's early life, what was what stood out about his early life, and what gave you any indication that he was destined for perhaps greatness?
Well, nothing in his early life would give any indication he was destined for greatness. What he wanted to do was be an actor, and if he couldn't do that, be a radio personality. But the thing that most influenced his later life, I think, was partly the impact of his mother, and more directly the impact of her church, the Disciples of Christ. Because one of the things you see throughout Reagan's career is the belief that everything works according to God's plan. And he learned that from his mother and from his church. Another thing that he took away from that was the importance of private charity in curing the ills of the nation. And finally, the idea that America has a special mission in history. Those three things he took with him his whole life.
Well, when you look at his younger life, he served in the summertime as a lifeguard at a local beach by a river that went through his hometown. And what was the last count of how many lives that he saved during that service?
It's a little iffy because there might be one or two that didn't get recorded, but 77, I think, is the usual number. The biggest compliment on his skill came from his employers, who said there was no bodies at the bottom.
But he did find a way to get into broadcasting and into acting. How did that come about, Jim?
Well, among the families that used to vacation in Dixon were a couple of...
Dixon, Illinois.
A couple of famous people, the Walgreens, for instance. And from them, Reagan used to caddy when he wasn't lifeguarding. And from meeting these people, he decided that what he would like to do is be an actor. But he had the sense that you couldn't just go out and be an actor. And some of these folks told him maybe the route you want to take is go to radio first. So that's how he got in.
And his first job was as a sportscaster on a little station in Iowa?
Yeah, he went out looking. He went to Chicago, couldn't get any interviews, and they said, look, start out in the sticks. So he did. He got in the car, drove off. First town he came to was Davenport, Iowa. He walked in. Guy said, no jobs here, and Reagan looked very disappointed. He said, well, I tell you what, let me give you a quick test. Describe a sports event for me. So Reagan sat down and basically broadcast a quarter of one of the games he had played in college. And the fellow thought, that's pretty darn good. Come back next week. And that's how it started.
Mm-hmm. How did he make the transition then, Jim, from sportscasting to acting?
Well, one of the things he did when he moved to Des Moines, which had a much bigger market, is in between the sports broadcasting, he would have, I guess, what we would call a talk show today, where he'd interview people. And several times, actors came through Des Moines, and he would interview them. And one of them basically encouraged him to come out and have a screen test. So that's how he got his start.
And he rose all the way to become the president of the Screen Actors Guild.
He
now,
did.
What would you consider to be the highlights of his acting career? Or what did he consider to be the highlight of his acting career?
I think most people would say the best movie he ever made was King's Row, which was it's very unlike Reagan. It was a dark, depressing movie. But the most interesting thing to me was one of the first things he got was a series of 4 movies where he played Brass Bancroft, who was a sort of a young, eager, two-fisted treasury agent. And the young boys just ate this up. And one of them was so enchanted by this that he decided when he grew up he'd become a Secret Service agent. And he did. And on a cold March day in 1981 in D.C., he saved Reagan's life.
Wow, that's a powerful story.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting story. It's an interesting story, too, how Reagan goes from acting into politics and decides to run for governor of California. How did that come about, Jim?
Well, it started, of course, with going into the union, which he at first didn't like a lot of workers. He thought being forced to join a union was a horrible thing. But he learned that the dictatorial way the studios were run in Hollywood, it turned out, he thought, to be good, and then he rose to be president of the Screen Actors Guild half a dozen times, and that's where he got his start at negotiating and doing most of what you do in politics except going out and have the public vote for you. And then when his acting career began to go downhill after the war, his brother got him a job on General Electric Theater, where he was the MC. But the big thing was he went out a third of the year and went all over the country speaking to audiences in the General Electric plants. And that's what turned him from a liberal, he was really far left in Hollywood, to being conservative. He was talking to his fellow union members, and he'd tell them about all the problems Hollywood had with taxes and government, and they'd say, hey, you think that's bad, let me tell you about our problems. And so it was actually his fellow union members that basically, through their stories, turned him from a raving liberal to a solid conservative. So
he becomes eventually a 2-term governor of the largest state in the Union. What are the highlights of his service in California?
Well, not what you'd expect. The very first thing he did was push through the biggest tax increase, not just in California's history, but the biggest tax increase of any state in all of American history up to that time.
Why was that necessary?
Because when his predecessor, Pat Brown, walked out the door, he left a big deficit, and Reagan wanted to cut spending. But the legislature was controlled by Democrats, and they simply wouldn't accept cutting. So the only thing else you could do, since the law requires a balanced budget, was raise taxes.
What kind of shape was California in when he left office?
Much better. There was a government surplus. Property taxes had been cut substantially. On the other hand, state taxes had gone up. Lots more money was spent on education than before, but the signature probably of his governorship was welfare reform, where he sat down with the liberal Speaker of the House, and they carved out a system that increased welfare payments to people who really needed it, imposed a work requirement, cut down on fraud, and it became really the national model for welfare reform.
And then Reagan becomes really the darling of the conservative movement. Of course, Barry Goldwater is given lots of credit for starting the conservative, modern conservative movement in America. And of course, his banner is taken up by Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan sort of decides to struggle against the Eastern liberal, moderate Republican establishment, doesn't he? And he goes after the 1976 presidential nomination, despite the fact that we have a sitting president in Gerald Ford.
That's right. And one of the most interesting things Reagan did, although he, in a sense, inherited Goldwater's mantle, was Reagan was the man who turned the conservative movement from a backward-looking, pessimistic movement to a forward-looking, optimistic movement. Bill Buckley often said conservatives have the duty of standing on the tracks and telling the locomotive of history to stop. Well, you weren't going to do that. Reagan thought history was moving in a conservative direction. Liberty was going to win, statism and communism were going to lose. and that completely reoriented the conservative movement.
Well, now he doesn't succeed in taking away the nomination from Jerry Ford in 1976, and actually there's a story behind the scenes that Jerry Ford offered him the vice presidential nomination. Was that correct? And if it was, what did your research show as to why he may have turned it down?
There was talk of it, but it was never made a formal offer.
Okay.
I think Ford's people thought that would be a ridiculous thing to do after Reagan had hounded him. Remember, Reagan only lost very narrowly the nomination to a sitting president, which is an amazing thing when you think about it.
And in 1980, he wins the nomination, and he has to run against a sitting president in Jimmy Carter. What are the highlights of that campaign, Jim?
Well, the highlights, I think, that tie into his future as president, or the fact that he spent the whole year running as he had for the last 15 or 20 as a private citizen, as governor, against big government, in favor of cutting taxes, against expanded spending, and especially insisting that the United States had a responsibility, as his idol Franklin Roosevelt had said before World War II, to stand up against tyranny, which, of course, in his day was communism. One of the most interesting things in the campaign was when he gave his acceptance speech. And at the very end,
at the
Republican convention, and at the very end, he said, "I'm afraid, almost afraid to ask you this, but I'm more afraid not to. Can we end our convention with a moment of silence?" Which they did. And one of the journalists present said, "It is hard to think of any candidate for president who would dare to do that or who could bring it off." Reagan did.
Now, in this presidential race, for a while, at least at the beginning of the race, it looked as if President Carter was going to make Reagan the issue.
Absolutely.
Reagan was too rash. He was too bold, too unpredictable to occupy the presidency. And the race seemed to be very close at the very beginning. But what happened to transform that race?
Well, a couple of things happened. The very first thing both candidates did after the two nominations, Jimmy Carter publicly gave a hug to George Wallace, the segregationist former governor of Alabama. Reagan gave a very public hug to the father of Lech Wałęsa, the patriot leader of the anti-communist movement in Poland. And that kind of set the tone for the campaign. Carter knew he had to gobble up Southern votes, both black and white. Reagan knew he had to run as the man who could project American strength against communism, but do it in a way that didn't scare people that he was going to start a war.
It was a remarkable turnaround, wasn't it, Jim? In 1976, Jimmy Carter wins every southern state of the old Confederacy except Virginia. Right. And then in 1980, Ronald Reagan wins every southern state with the exception of Carter's home state of Georgia.
That's right. And, a lot of people thought Reagan would be perhaps intimidated by running against an incumbent president like that, especially in that last debate where you're on the same stage only a few feet away from the leader of the free world. Somebody asked him if he hadn't been a little bit nervous. He said, "No," he said, "I've been on the stage with John Wayne."
Well, certainly in that, the fact that he was on the stage with John Wayne, that may have been noticed by the militant Iranians, because what happened after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, within hours, what happened?
Well, the Iranians, of course, released the American hostages, and Reagan certainly wanted to give Carter, as much credit as he could for standing up to them. He was prepared, even in the midst of his inaugural address, to, if the news had come that they were on their way out, to call Carter up and congratulate him.
Mm-hmm. Now, how did Reagan go about crafting a team? Now he's not going to be the governor of a state. He's the president of the most important nation in the free world. How does he go about putting together a team to help him govern in Washington, D.C.? The
most important thing he did was, like Lincoln, not be afraid of bringing in opponents. He picked, for example, Jim Baker, who had run George Bush's campaign and had denounced him as his Treasury Secretary and Chief of Staff. He picked Bush himself, who denounced Reagan's economic ideas as voodoo economics,
That's right.
to be his vice president. In fact, there were so many people like that some of the Reaganites were a little worried. One of them said, I look at these names and I see here's some Ford people, here's the Bush people. Where are the Reagan people?
Mm-hmm. So in the first 4 years, his first term, what were the major accomplishments?
Well, I'm sure he would say the biggest thing was the tax cut in 1981, which combined with the tax reform of 86, in the last 30 years has saved American taxpayers many, many billions of dollars.
And many economists claim that is the longest peacetime, led to the longest peacetime economic expansion in American history.
Right, and I think what you might even want to say trumped that was killing inflation. Because when Reagan came in, the 70s had been the highest inflationary decade for at least 100 years in American history.
And he killed inflation in a different way than President Clinton did. President Clinton, I believe, has taken fuel and food out of the calculations, whereas those items were still in the calculations when we were calculating inflation rates under the Reagan presidency. Isn't that right?
Sure, and it was painful. The '82 recession was the most painful economic downturn since the Depression. And Reagan took an awful lot of flack for it. He said you could tell his economic ideas were working when the journalists stopped calling it Reaganomics.
And Reagan turns us around economically. On the international front, he has to deal with the Cold War, which of course had been continued on since President Truman. And what surprising things did Reagan do to deal with the Soviet Union and Mikhail Gorbachev?
Well, when Reagan came in, we scarcely remember it today, but the Soviet Union was expanding its power. They had invaded Afghanistan. There were pro-Soviet regimes in 2 or 3 African countries. They were putting pressure on Western Europe. And Reagan came in determined to reverse the détente and coexistence kind of attitude that he thought had allowed this to happen. But the interesting thing was that in the end, he's the one who wound up, of course, defusing tensions and ending the Cold War. And there's where he and some of his conservative supporters parted company for a while. I think he was maybe the only prominent person in 1980 who didn't think the Soviet Union was here to stay, was a fixed part of the political firmament. You had to get along with them. He thought the Soviet Union was basically a decaying body inside a suit of armor, and that it was not going to last long.
And we were in our last minute now.
Yes.
He also was credited with essentially spending their defense establishment into bankruptcy, essentially by saying we're making great progress on Star Wars when we weren't.
That's right. It scared the Russians to death. The biggest way you can see the world changed because of Reagan is look at Nikita Khrushchev comes to the U.S. in 1960, pounds his shoe on the table, says, "We will bury you." Khrushchev's son, Sergei, comes to the U.S. in 1999, raises his hand and takes the oath of allegiance as an American citizen. That, I think, is an example of how the world had changed.
Well, Jim, we want to thank you for joining us today. And if our viewers are interested in buying your book, they can find it on the internet, right? And they can simply contact us at Susquehanna Valley Center, and we'll be able to send them more information about purchasing
the name of the book is Ronald Reagan, Champion of Conservative America.
I want to thank you, Jim, for being with us. What's your next project?
Don't know yet. Back to the early republic, I imagine.
Okay, thanks for being with us. We'll see you next week on Behind the Headlines. Join us then.